In 1930, in the beginning of the year, so many people was made sad.
So welcome. If this is your first time joining us, thank you. If you're a returning visitor of our virtual visits, thank you also. My name is Rebecca P. Seimer. I'm the curator here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. So today we have William Isom and Hannah Rexroad, and they're going to be taking us through our current feature gallery, Black and White Knoxville in the Jim Crow Era. So at this time, a big thank you to our presenters, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to them so they can introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Hannah Rexroad. I'm the Education and Volunteer Programs Manager here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. And joining us today is...
I'm William Isom. I'm the Director of Community Outreach for East Tennessee PBS here in Knoxville. And I'm also the Director of the Black and Appalachia Project.
And today we are going to be going through our exhibit Black and White Knoxville in the Jim Crow Era. I'll be giving you some background on the actual exhibit itself, and William will be sharing some of the most interesting stories in our exhibit. But we're not going to give everything away because we do want you to come visit now that we are open again. The first thing, we would like to give special thanks to everyone who worked on the exhibit, including Mr. Robert Booker, as well as Steve Cottom from the McClung Historical Collection, and the Delaney Project, the Knoxville Museum of Art, as well as Black and Appalachia, and the Beck Cultural Center. So this exhibit kind of came out of the idea that there are so many Knoxville stories that haven't been told over the years, and it really was a group effort. This exhibit opened in February with the intent to close in June of 2020. With COVID, obviously that was not about to happen. So luckily we are keeping this open until February of 2021, so don't worry, you do still have plenty of time to come in and see it. Now, Knoxville has long been portrayed in the histories as a very progressive, racially tolerant city. But in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, it gave rise to the Jim Crow era. And it became very apparent that the Black population in Knoxville was not being given the promise that America had given to justice and equality and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not being upheld for all Tennesseans. And so as we go through this exhibit, you'll see a lot of very contradictory things that have been going on in Knoxville throughout history. But first, we are going to get started over here. And this is kind of the intro to the exhibit. So these are our questions that we want you to think about as you go through. What was life like for African Americans in Knoxville during the Jim Crow era? What influence did the city have in the early lives of artists Buford and Joseph Delaney? And could an African American artist such as Ruth Cobb Bryce gain recognition without leaving home? And those are three of the artists that this exhibit really does revolve around, while also bringing in the bigger context of Knoxville and the nation in the Jim Crow era. Now, you might be familiar with the phrase, the Jim Crow era, but not a lot of people know where it came from. So we'll pan over to these panels. And Jim Crow is the nickname given to laws and social customs that allowed for the segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans. Jim Crow was actually a character developed by Thomas Rice in 1830 as a blackface character. Minstrel shows were very often white performers with blackened faces mimicking enslaved Africans on Southern plantations. And so the Jim Crow era, as you can imagine, did reflect those values that at the time were very commonplace. And the Jim Crow era was characterized by voter suppression, as well as racial intolerance and lynchings and other racially charged violence. So now we are going to come on over here and I'm going to show you one more thing. So this exhibit is set up in a timeline. And so as you go through the following timeline, these colors are used for the panels. Black panels relate stories of kind of general historical interest. Red and gold panels illustrate what life was like for African Americans living in Knoxville. Blue panels have to do with the art scene in Knoxville, and green panels explore the stereotypical imagery common to the Jim Crow era. So now I am going to hand it over to William Isom, who is going to take over and share some of his favorite stories from this exhibit.
Hey, so there's a lot in this exhibit, and it's very vast. But there's a couple of stories that I really personally like, and I think are kind of emblematic of Black life in East Tennessee and Knoxville specifically. One is the story of William Bennett Scott, who created the first Black newspaper in Tennessee. He was in Maryville in Blount County, and he also became an alderman. So he created his newspaper in 1865, which was right after the Civil War and right after Emancipation, which I think is really amazing. He was also the mayor of Maryville, which a lot of people don't know, and served as an alderman. William Bennett Scott also established St. Paul AME Zion Church in Maryville, and the Freedman School that taught a lot of Black teachers that then went out into all over the South and taught in different Black schools all over the region. So the story of William Bennett Scott is just one of these stories that I think is really interesting. But, you know, just like Hannah talked about, like these stories also exist within contradictions. We have the first Black newspaper coming out of East Tennessee, but we also had, in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee. So a lot of these things were happening in tandem to one another. So let's keep walking. You can see there's a lot of stuff that we're not going to be talking about, so feel free to come visit.
You'll have to come visit to be able to see it all. But our next stop is going to be over here with the Appalachian Exposition of 1910. And as you can see, we have a number of artifacts from it as well as pictures. This picture that is prominently displayed in this exhibit is the Negro building from the exposition. And the exposition did also have a Negro Day because, again, it was a very segregated time in East Tennessee and our nation's history. And now if we can zoom in on the poster from the Appalachian Exposition, this is something I like to focus on because it does show that juxtaposition between what East Tennesseans wanted people to think and also what was going on. So this is the poster from the 1910 exposition, and you see this woman looking out and everything is beautiful, but if you look very closely, there are still Black East Tennesseans picking cotton in this picture, which is interesting because one, not only was that not the cash crop of this part of the state, but also the exposition was a way for East Tennesseans and other Appalachians to kind of show the rest of the country that they weren't kind of the hillbillies that a lot of people thought they were. Yet this was also the imagery that went alongside it, which reinforced a lot of the stereotypes of Appalachia at that time. So we're going to head on over to William now.
So this exhibit set out in the timeline of three Knoxville artists, Ruth Cobb Bryce, Buford Delaney, and Joseph Delaney. And I really enjoy the story of Ruth Cobb Bryce because number one, she did something that a lot of the young people in the region still continue to struggle with today. Is like, how do you stay in this region? How do you make this a place that you want to stay in and can live and thrive? And throughout Ruth Cobb Bryce's life, she continued to do that. In 1918, she graduated from Swift Memorial Institute in Rogersville, Tennessee, which was a historically Black college. But we talked about these contradictions, and the creation of Swift Memorial College happened because the state of Tennessee in 1901 determined that it was illegal for private institutions, private colleges such as Swift Memorial, such as Maryville College, to not have segregated facilities. And so basically the state of Tennessee forced Maryville College to segregate. Well, out of that was born Swift Memorial Institute when Maryville College gave 1/10 of its endowment to the creation and education of Blacks in East Tennessee. And so Ruth Cobb Bryce was one of those people. She went on to teach school in La Follette, Tennessee and Greenville, Tennessee. And so it's that whole kind of thing where there's these bad policies are enacted, but people still find a way to live and thrive within that. And I think her story is really amazing.
And one of the more well-known stories here in Knoxville, especially, that you'll see in our exhibit is the story of the 1919 race riots, a part of the Red Summer that swept America with racially charged violence. And Maurice Mays, a black man, was charged with the murder of Bertie Lindsay. And there was a mob intent on lynching Mays, and Mays luckily had already been hustled out of the jail to safety. Now, the juxtaposition that I like to touch on here is that this happened just a year after World War I ended, when you had a number of African-American soldiers fighting for their country and then returning to a country where they were treated as second-class citizens. And that is what fueled a lot of the violence and rage that people felt on both sides at that time. It stemmed from World War I and a lot of the other conflicts going on both in the nation and around the world. And we are going to head over to William for his next story.
Yeah, so in 1922, Ruth Cobb Bryce actually went and taught at Swift Memorial Institute in Rogersville. But also in 1922, Joseph Delaney, who's another artist featured in this exhibit, he left Knoxville. And the best part for me about this story is like and I'm embellishing a bit, but basically Joseph Delaney got drunk and left Knoxville and went to go work in a coal mine in eastern Kentucky. He went to a place called Lynch, which was a separate but equal as you could be company town in eastern Kentucky in Harlan County. And so he went there and worked. And the reason this story stands out to me is because oftentimes early on during the Great Migration, a lot of black folks from the South, the mountains, the coal mines, and the coal fields of southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky and West Virginia were like the first stop in the Great Migration for a lot of black families leaving the South. And so it was interesting for me to see this was Joseph's first stop out of Knoxville. He continued to like hobo and travel around for a while, which also shows the kind of the difference in the things that we still struggle with today in this region. Ruth Cobb Bryce fought and stayed, or tried to stay, and Joseph Delaney left, came back, left, and so he kind of came and went. And so we see that today with our young people in the region also.
And also the Great Migration, as that was going on, some people might wonder why people would black people would have left the South, and one of the reasons would be the emergence and kind of re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, just a couple weeks ago was about a little over 100 years from when they had Klan Day here at in Chilhowie Park here in Knoxville. And between 1900 and 1910, the black population of both Tennessee and Knoxville went down about 2%, even though the population itself was growing. So that really does give you a view into kind of what the effects of the Jim Crow era in the South were on both the demographics of Knoxville and the state.
Another very famous participant in the Great Migration from Knoxville was the artist Buford Delaney, the third artist featured in this exhibition. And Buford was one of those people that joined the Great Migration. He left Knoxville and went to Boston for a little while, went to New York City at the end of the Harlem Renaissance, at the beginning of the Great Depression. Stayed in New York for a while and kind of got his chops about him in regards to being an artist, and then left and went to Paris, where he ultimately stayed. He came back and visited Knoxville a few times, but he passed away in Paris and is buried there now. And I think the story of Buford is emblematic of those that feel like they have to leave the region and they hardly ever come back, if at all. And I think one of the things that's important to point out in Buford's story is that Buford was gay. And so I think that for a Southern black man artist in the South, you know, sometimes, and even still today, your only option is to leave. And so, so that you can thrive and have a full life. While Buford's life was very rich, and he met a lot of people such as Georgia O'Keeffe, County Cullen, but the most famous and dearest friend of Buford Delaney was James Baldwin, the great author. And you know, would he have been able to be in contact with these great minds if he had stayed in Knoxville? Unfortunately, probably not.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick look at some art by Ruth Cobb Bryce. Ruth Cobb Bryce did become the first African-American member of the Knoxville Art Center, which later becomes the Doolin Art Gallery. And she was also the first African-American woman from Knoxville to have her writing published, although she did use a pen name, which was the name of her maternal grandmother. And over here is one of our panels that touches on stereotypes in the Jim Crow era and afterwards. This is the invisible stereotype. And unfortunately, a lot of these stories that we are telling you and that you can find all over the country have been invisible for a very long time. This is a history, Black history has very often been marginalized, both in the textbooks and in museums and historic sites, but through organizations like Black in Appalachia and museums like the East Tennessee Historical Society and many others, they are now being told. And just think that if these are the stories that we're telling now, how many others are still out there that have yet to be told? So if you want to go out in your own community and find stories, we would love to hear them, as would Black in Appalachia and East Tennessee PBS. And so we encourage you to be mindful of getting a well-rounded look at history as you learn. And we hope you continue to learn for a long time. Now, Rebecca is going to walk you through the rest of our exhibit, and then we will be ready for question and answer. And something else we will touch on very quickly, because it is the first thing you see when you come into our exhibit, is this display case. These dolls represent kind of the mammy stereotype of Black women, both during and after the Civil War. And these are all dolls that are from the East Tennessee region. And unfortunately, this is still a stereotype that can be seen in the media today and in movies and books still being published and written. And the mammy stereotype is kind of that obedient, enslaved, motherly figure, and can have both a positive and negative impact on society. But this is what you are confronted with when you first come in the museum. So we do want to let you know that there are a lot of historical artifacts and depictions in our exhibit that are being presented the way that they would have been shown at the time to kind of foster a better understanding of the complex nature of racial relations in East Tennessee. We are ready for question and answer, so I hope some of you have submitted your questions, whether it be through Facebook or through Zoom. But Stephanie, if you want to send them our way.
Yes, thank you. We do have a few questions. The first one that I'm going to give to you is, what % of the population was Black in 1865?
In 1865,
I have heard from people that are smarter than me that the population of Tennessee as a whole in 1865 was right around 25%.
And the majority of that would have been in West and Middle Tennessee, simply because that's where a lot of the larger farms and plantations were, although there was both an enslaved and free Black population here in Knoxville and in the surrounding counties as well.
Okay. What are some resources you can suggest for people who want to educate themselves on the topics covered in the exhibit?
Well, I would recommend definitely checking out Black in Appalachia's website, as well as the Appalachian African American Cultural Center, which is in Southwest Virginia. Also, there are KMA, like we mentioned, has an exhibit on Buford Delaney as well right now. But there are a number of anti-racist articles talking about how to be an anti-racist. There's books. Also, if you're more interested in the history side of it, there's a number of resources available at county levels, as well as in each city. I know that, for example, the new State Museum has a wonderful exhibit exploring both slavery and post-emancipation in Tennessee.
Yeah, and I would suggest also the Beck Cultural Exchange Center here in Knoxville is a good resource. But the blackinappalachia.org website, we've been developing teacher's guides, and so there's some resource lists, particularly about Buford Delaney and Knoxville's Red Summer, and so there's a Knoxville page, and so that stuff exists there, and it's all free, and you can download it and do what you want.
And there are a number of books that cover topics like Juneteenth in East Tennessee history. In fact, William wrote one of them, as well as a number of books on African American population in this area by Mr. Boger.
Okay. How can folks become involved with Black in Appalachia?
How can folks become involved with Black in Appalachia?
Well, that's interesting. Here's Dr. Nkechi Alameen has popped in, special guest.
Hi, everybody.
So if you want to get involved with Black in Appalachia, the best thing to do is to send an email to info@blackinappalachia.org, and we can try to figure out how to plug you in. There's all sorts of research and media projects that we're engaged in continuously. And so if you're interested in helping out, just shoot an email and we can figure out like where you're at geographically and what kind of skills you have and what you're comfortable with doing. And there's always a need for people to help out, as Hannah knows.
Okay, the last question it looks like we have, are there still instances of segregation today?
The straight answer to that is yes. Redlining and gerrymandering, as well as voter suppression, are still issues that are seen not just here in Tennessee, but all over the country. And there are a number of wonderful books about that. I think The Color of Law, I believe, is one of them. And as you do your own research, I would recommend looking into both the history and what's happening in today's news to kind of inform yourself as you learn about it.
Segregation.
Yeah, segregation still.
Segregation exists, yes, in schools and housing especially. And because it's in housing, it sort of festers out into everything else. So if you want to know more about segregation in America, look into housing in America. And The Color of Law is a great book to start.
Yeah, economically, one of the things that was said to me once is that, Knoxville's Black population today sits at 40% of Knoxville's Black population lives under the poverty line, under the poverty rates. And so that is a form of economic segregation that's visible. And one of the things that was said is like, and is in this book is like, one of the things that we've not achieved as a people is economic parity. And so that's kind of the thing that we're struggling with now is like across the board, equal access to resources and investment in healthy investment in communities.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for this really meaningful look at this current feature exhibit. Again, that's Black and White, Knoxville in the Jim Crow Era. I do want to apologize for some slight technical difficulties, but a big thanks to William Isom and Hannah Rexroad for a great presentation. Again, please stay tuned for information regarding our next virtual visit, which will be held on October the 15th. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you tune in next time.
Who's doing this murdering? Nobody knows. But the good book says they got to read just what they sow. While Satan is so busy